At 7:45 a.m. on June 1st, 1940, flight leader Douglas Bader climbed his Hawker Hurricane to 3,000 feet above the French coast, near Dunkirk. Out of nowhere, a Messerschmitt Bf 109 appeared dead ahead, flying in the same direction at almost exactly the same speed. Bader was 29 years old then, having only been on combat duty for 4 weeks. No one could have imagined that a training accident 9 years earlier had cost him both legs, a blow that should have spelled the permanent end of his flying career. The Messerschmitt pilot made no evasive moves, holding a steady course. Bader's fighter was loaded with 400 rounds of ammunition, and a mere 300 yards of empty sky separated him from his first kill. Rewind to December 14th, 1931, at Woodley Aerodrome near Reading. The 21-year-old Bader was already a rising star in No. 23 Squadron of the Royal Air Force, RAF, soaring high in a Bristol Bulldog fighter. Someone at the Reading Flying Club had challenged him, claiming he couldn't pull off a slow roll below 500 feet, a maneuver strictly prohibited by regulations below 2,000 feet. But Bader was never one to back down from a challenge. He took off, and at 200 feet, he initiated the slow roll. Disaster struck when the tip of his left wing scraped the grass. The Bulldog flipped out of control, crashed into the ground, and exploded in a fiery ball. Later that day, at the Royal Berkshire Hospital, surgeon J. Leonard Joyce amputated Bader's right leg. Doctors told his family that the young pilot would most likely succumb to shock and blood loss. 3 days later, worsening wound infections forced them to amputate his left leg too, the right below the knee, the left above it. In his flight log, Bader wrote only one short line: "Crashed during low-level slow roll. Poor performance." In March 1932, the RAF Medical Board reviewed his case and handed down an unshakable verdict. Pilots with prosthetic limbs could not meet flight standards. At 21, Bader was discharged from service, granted a full disability pension, and his flying career seemed to have drawn a definitive close. Over the next 8 years, Bader took a job at Shell Oil Company. He learned to walk on aluminum and leather prosthetics, drove a modified car, and even became a single-digit handicap golfer. But his obsession with flying never wavered, not for a single moment. In September 1939, Germany invaded Poland, and World War II erupted in full force. Bader immediately reached out to every contact he had in the RAF. From the Royal Air Force College Cranwell to No. 23 Squadron, he called every commander who remembered him, demanding resolutely to be reinstated for combat duty. The Air Ministry flatly refused at first, then backtracked, saying it might be considered. Eventually, they agreed to let him take a medical flight test. In November 1939, at the Central Flying School, the examiners fully expected Bader to struggle with even basic maneuvers. Instead, he executed aerobatics, loops, rolls, spin dives, and recoveries with seamless precision. The chief examiner's assessment was unequivocal: exceptional performance. At the time, the RAF had no regulations whatsoever for pilots with prosthetics. No one had ever attempted such a feat before. All it would take was the medical board's approval, and he could return to the skies. In February 1940, Bader got his wish. His first posting was with No. 19 Squadron, stationed at Duxford, flying Supermarine Spitfires. In May that year, he flew his first combat patrol over Dunkirk. Then came that fateful day on June 1st. At 3,000 feet, he locked onto the Messerschmitt Bf 109. At 300 yards, he squeezed the trigger, but his shots went high. The German pilot still showed no reaction, flying straight ahead. Bader quickly adjusted his aim and fired again. Tracer rounds streaked across the sky, striking the Bf 109's fuselage dead center and shattering its canopy instantly. The German fighter rolled left and plummeted toward the English Channel. It was Bader's first confirmed kill. 2 weeks later, Bader was transferred to No. 242 Squadron as acting squadron leader. Most of the pilots in this unit were Canadians, and they had been badly mauled in the Battle of France, losing friends, losing planes, and their morale was at rock bottom. To make matters worse, the squadron was critically short on supplies, with no spare parts or maintenance tools to speak of. Bader immediately sent a telegram to Wing headquarters. No, 242 squadron pilots are combat ready, but we are severely under-equipped. Repeat, severely under-equipped. Unable to carry out operational missions. He flatly refused to accept any combat assignments until the supply issues were fully resolved. Within 48 hours, all the urgently needed parts arrived. Curious about the heart-stopping story of how Bader was shot down by the Germans at 30,000 feet? Hit that like button. Your support helps us share more forgotten hero stories with the world. If you haven't subscribed yet, click the subscribe button right now. All right, let's get back to Bader's incredible saga. By July 1940, No. 242 Squadron was fully prepared for action, and the Battle of Britain had officially begun. German bombers crossed the English Channel every day, escorted all the way by Messerschmitt fighters. On July 11th, Bader intercepted a Dornier Do-17 bomber over the North Sea near Norfolk. After just 2 short bursts of gunfire, the bomber trailed thick smoke and vanished into the clouds. On August 30th, Bader led 12 Hurricanes into battle against 100 German aircraft over Essex. His squadrons shot down 12 enemy planes without suffering a single casualty. A stunning achievement. No one could have guessed that Bader's prosthetic legs would turn out to be his secret aerial advantage. When other pilots pulled high-G turns, blood would rush to their lower bodies, often causing temporary blackouts. But Bader's aluminum prosthetics didn't retain blood, allowing him to stay conscious longer during high-G maneuvers and pull tighter, faster turns. By August 1941, Bader had racked up 21 confirmed kills, ranking 5th among the top aces of the RAF Fighter Command. By then, he had been promoted to wing commander, stationed at RAF Tangmere, leading 3 squadrons in frequent offensive sweeps deep into French airspace. The Germans already knew his radio call sign by heart and had even studied his tactical methods in detail. On August 9, 1941, at 30,000 feet over Lille, the Luftwaffe set a carefully laid trap, waiting for Bader to fly right into it. At 9 a.m. that day at RAF Tangmere, Wing Commander Bader climbed into a Supermarine Spitfire Mark VB, serial number W3185, emblazoned with his personal initials, DB. The ground crew had already performed a full inspection. 8 machine guns were fully loaded, fuel tanks were topped off, and the oxygen system was working flawlessly. Bader buckled his seatbelt, put on his oxygen mask, and fired up the Merlin engine. That morning, 3 squadrons, a total of 48 Spitfires, took off on orders to conduct a fighter sweep over northern France. The tactical objective of the mission was crystal clear: cross the English Channel, climb to 30,000 feet, lure German fighters into the air, and destroy them, thereby pinning down Luftwaffe forces in France and preventing them from reinforcing the Eastern Front, where Germany had invaded the Soviet Union 2 months earlier. Since March that year, Bader had flown 63 identical missions, and the routine had become second nature. RAF fighters would fly over France, German radar would spot them, Messerschmitts would scramble to intercept. The 2 sides would engage in fierce combat for about 15 minutes, then each would claim victory, while both suffered aircraft losses. At 10:15 a.m., the Tangmere wing reached the French coast. Visibility was perfect, with not a cloud in the sky, a deceptively dangerous condition for fighter combat. If a dogfight went wrong, there would be nowhere to hide. Bader scanned the sky relentlessly, checking every direction without pause. He knew full well that Messerschmitt fighters always preferred to launch surprise attacks from the direction of the sun. Sure enough, at 30,000 feet over Lille, he spotted his targets. 12 Bf-109Fs climbing 4,000 feet below, completely unaware of the approaching RAF fighters. Bader immediately radioed the sighting to his wing, then dove his Spitfire into the attack. The aerial situation couldn't have been more favorable. He held the high ground, the speed advantage, and the perfect position, while the German fighters were still in the climb phase. Bader locked onto the lead aircraft of the German formation, closing in rapidly to 200 yards. His thumb pressed firmly on the firing button, and all 8 Browning machine guns erupted in a hail of fire, spewing 400 rounds per second. The German fighter's engine was hit instantly, spewing a cloud of white coolant mist. Trailing thick smoke, it veered off to the side, most likely a total loss. Bader pulled his aircraft up sharply, scanning the sky for his next target. Soon enough, he spotted an enemy fighter making a left turn at his 11 o'clock position. Bader decisively cut inside the enemy's turn radius, unleashing a 3-second burst of gunfire. The Bf-109's tail section disintegrated on the spot, and its pilot was forced to bail out. His parachute blossomed open at 28,000 feet. In just 90 seconds, Bader had shot down 2 enemy planes, bringing his personal total to 23 confirmed kills. But the tide of battle turned in an instant. The remaining German fighters had finally reacted, swinging around to counterattack. Bader's wingman radioed a frantic warning. 4 Bf-10-9s were closing in from high at his 7 o'clock position. Bader immediately initiated a split S maneuver to evade. But then came a violent jolt of impact. Disaster had struck. The ear-splitting sounds of tearing metal and snapping control cables filled the cockpit, and his Spitfire lurched violently to the right. Bader glanced over his shoulder, and his heart sank like a stone. The vertical stabilizer was gone, torn clean off, and a huge chunk of the fuselage had been ripped away. The fighter flipped into an inverted spin, nose pointing straight down, plummeting toward the ground 30,000 feet below. Bader reached for the canopy release handle and pulled hard. The canopy flew off instantly, and the 300-mile-per-hour wind slammed into him like a knife. He unbuckled his seatbelt, trying to stand up, but his right leg wouldn't move an inch. His prosthetic was wedged tightly between the seat and the control stick, stuck fast. The rapidly spinning fighter had jammed the prosthetic in place, and no matter how hard he pulled, it wouldn't budge. The altimeter numbers were dropping like a stone. 25,000 feet, 20,000 feet. Bader clawed desperately at the trapped prosthetic, but it remained immovable. At 15,000 feet, Bader calculated his remaining time in a split second. He had only 30 seconds left, maybe even less, before the crash. The fighter was falling faster and faster, the spin growing more violent by the second. Bader made a quick, agonizing decision. He unfastened the upper strap that secured his right prosthetic to his thigh, leaving the prosthetic wedged in the cockpit. Using nothing but the strength of his arms, he struggled to climb out of the seat. The 300-mile-per-hour wind tried to yank him out of the aircraft, but the lower strap of the prosthetic was still wrapped tightly around his leg. Half of his body hung outside the cockpit, while the other half remained trapped. The centrifugal force from the spinning fighter was pulling him back toward the seat with brutal force. At 10,000 feet, Bader didn't hesitate for a second. He grabbed the parachute ripcord and pulled it hard. The parachute opened instantly, and the tremendous force of deceleration jerked his body upward violently. The remaining strap on the prosthetic couldn't bear the strain and snapped with a loud crack. Bader finally broke free from the disintegrating fighter. He looked down and saw that his left prosthetic was still securely attached, while his right leg ended abruptly at the knee. His missing prosthetic was still stuck in the Spitfire W3185, plummeting toward the ground with the wreckage. 12 seconds later, the fighter crashed into the earth 4 miles south of Lille. The massive explosion sent a plume of black smoke billowing 200 feet into the sky. Hanging beneath his parachute, Bader watched helplessly as his beloved Spitfire was consumed by a ball of fire. Now he had only one prosthetic leg, was completely unarmed, had no escape equipment, and was about to land on German-occupied French soil. To make matters worse, German soldiers on the ground were already racing toward his landing zone. At 11:05 a.m., Bader hit the ground hard. His head slammed into the dirt, and his vision went black. He lost consciousness instantly. When he opened his eyes again, two German soldiers were standing over him. One was busy unbuckling his parachute harness, while the other stared at his right leg in utter disbelief. The German soldier said something in German, pointing at his empty trouser leg. Bader could hear the tone in his voice. The Germans thought he had lost the leg in the crash. They would never have imagined that both of his legs were prosthetics. 15 minutes later, a Luftwaffe vehicle arrived at the scene. 4 soldiers lifted Bader into the truck and drove north towards Saint-Omer. The German field hospital had been converted from a French school, with a bright red cross painted on the roof above the white walls. Inside, German medical staff were busy treating wounded Luftwaffe pilots. Bader was the only British prisoner of war that day. The doctor in charge of examining him was a Luftwaffe captain. After the checkup, he reported that Bader had suffered nothing more than a mild concussion, some bruising on his left ribs, and a few scrapes on his arms. Nothing life-threatening. But when the doctor saw Bader's left prosthetic leg, he froze in shock. He immediately summoned an interpreter and fired off a flurry of questions. Through the interpreter, Bader explained that he had lost both legs in a crash while flying a Bristol Bulldog fighter in December 1931. The doctor then asked how long he had been flying with prosthetics. Bader replied, "Since February 1940, 18 months of combat flying experience." The captain couldn't believe his ears at first. What Air Force would allow a double amputee to fly fighter jets in combat? But when he pulled Bader's service record out of his uniform pocket, he was completely stunned. The record stated clearly, Wing Commander rank, recipient of the Distinguished Service Order, DSO, the Distinguished Flying Cross, DFC, and BAR, Tangmere Wing Commander, with 23 confirmed aerial victories. Only then did the doctor realize that the man lying before him was one of the top aces of the Royal Air Force. He turned and walked out of the ward. 30 minutes later, he returned with his commanding officer. At 1 p.m., Major Adolf Galland walked into the ward. The 30-year-old German officer was the commander of Jagdgeschwader 26, with 94 confirmed kills to his name, ranking third among the top Luftwaffe aces. Galland had long heard of Bader's reputation. British intelligence reports had mentioned the brave wing commander leading operations from Tangmere many times. The RAF pilot who frequently led large fighter formations deep into French airspace. But German intelligence had never known that Bader was a double amputee with prosthetic legs. Galland stared at Bader's prosthetic, then at his empty right trouser leg. His English was fluent enough to converse with Bader directly. He asked about the details of the crash and the whereabouts of his missing prosthetic. Bader explained truthfully, "My right prosthetic got stuck in the cockpit, and I had to leave it there. Later, when the parachute opened, the force of the pull snapped the strap on the prosthetic." Galland nodded in understanding, then asked Bader what he needed. Bader replied, "Medical care, food, water, and a new prosthetic leg. He needed it to walk." Galland promised to do what he could to help, then asked for the contact information of the Royal Air Force and any messages Bader wanted to send. Bader told him everything. As he watched Galland walk away, though, Bader was filled with doubt. German officers usually treated captured pilots with courtesy and professionalism, but asking the enemy to coordinate the delivery of a prosthetic leg seemed like a pipe dream. But Bader would be in for a huge surprise. That very evening, Galland contacted the Luftwaffe headquarters in Lille, explaining the situation in detail. He requested permission to grant safe passage to a Royal Air Force aircraft to airdrop the needed medical supplies and prosthetic leg for a captured British wing commander. The request was passed up the chain of command, going all the way from Major General Theo Osterkamp to Field Marshal Hugo Sperle, before finally landing on the desk of the Commander-in-Chief of the Luftwaffe in Berlin, Hermann Göring himself. Göring had been a flying ace in World War I, and he understood the unique bond between pilots, even when they were bitter enemies. On August 10, 1941, Göring personally approved the request. On August 11th, Galland sent a message to the RAF Fighter Command through the International Red Cross. Wing Commander Douglas Bader of the Royal Air Force is currently in German custody and is in urgent need of a replacement prosthetic leg. The Luftwaffe will grant safe passage to a British aircraft to airdrop the prosthetic over Saint-Omer, with no anti-aircraft gunfire or fighter interception during the operation. The message included specific coordinates and a 4-hour airdrop window on August 19th. The message landed on the desk of Air Commodore Trafford Lee Mallory at Fighter Command Headquarters. Lee Mallory and Bader were close friends, having fought side by side during the Battle of Britain. This request was unprecedented, the enemy offering safe passage during wartime. But Lee Mallory also saw it as a golden opportunity. At the time, the RAF was planning a large-scale bombing raid on the Gazalek power station near Bethune in mid-August. Saint-Omer was only 20 miles away from Bethune, and the bombing formation was scheduled to fly right over the area anyway. Lee Mallory immediately approved a 2-for-1 plan. 6 Bristol Blenheim bombers would be dispatched on the mission, codenamed Circus 81, escorted by a large number of fighters. The bombers would first airdrop Bader's prosthetic over Saint-Omer, then continue on to their original target, the Gazalek power station. The Germans had only promised safe passage for the prosthetic airdrop, not for a bombing mission, and Lee Mallory had no intention of wasting this chance to strike a strategic target just because the Luftwaffe had shown chivalry to a captured pilot. At 8 a.m. on August 19, 1941, at RAF Waddisham, 6 Bristol Blenheim bombers taxied slowly toward the runway. Each aircraft was fully loaded with bombs for the attack on the Gazalek power station, but one bomber, serial number R3843, codenamed WWII, carried an extra wooden crate. Inside the crate was not only a new right prosthetic leg, but also matching straps, bandages, socks, and even tobacco and chocolate. A note was taped to the crate reading, "To be delivered to the Luftwaffe station commander at Saint-Omer and kindly forwarded to the British Royal Air Force prisoner of war, Wing Commander Bader." The pilot of this bomber was 23-year-old Flight Sergeant Jack Nicholson from Toronto. He had already received his mission briefing and knew the special nature of the operation. Fly to Saint-Omer, airdrop the crate. The Luftwaffe had promised safe passage with no anti-aircraft fire or fighter interception. After the airdrop, continue 20 miles southeast to the target, the Bethune power station. The formation climbed to 15,000 feet over the English Channel. German radar had already picked them up from Calais, and the Luftwaffe headquarters in Lille was monitoring the incoming formation closely. Galland had already issued orders to his pilots: no engagement with British aircraft until the prosthetic had been airdropped. After the airdrop, resume normal combat operations. Meanwhile, in the Saint-Omer hospital, Bader had been moved to a ward facing the airfield. The German guards told him that a Royal Air Force plane was on its way. Bader didn't believe a word of it at first, thinking it was just a German psychological warfare tactic. But at 9:30 a.m., he heard the unmistakable sound of aircraft engines, more than one. He hurried to the window and looked out. 6 Blenheim bombers were flying in formation, with a fighter escort circling above them on patrol. Nicholson flew the WVF bomber to 3,000 feet over Saint-Omer airfield. He opened the bomb bay doors and released the crate. A small parachute popped open immediately, carrying the crate gently down to the ground, landing precisely on the grass next to the main runway. German ground crew rushed forward to retrieve it right away. The Blenheim formation quickly reformed and headed southeast toward Bethune. Gallen stood in the airfield command post, watching the entire scene unfold. The prosthetic had been delivered safely, and the terms of the safe passage agreement had been fulfilled. He picked up the radio microphone and ordered his fighters to scramble immediately to intercept the British bomber formation. After all, the agreement only applied to the Saint-Omer area, not Bethune. 3 squadrons of Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters took off in a hurry, but the RAF escort fighters had already spotted the approaching German aircraft, and a fierce dogfight erupted at 15,000 feet over Bethune. At 10 a.m., the bomber formation reached the Gazalek power station, but by then the weather had taken a sudden turn for the worse. Thick clouds obscured the target, making precision bombing impossible. Even so, the pilots dropped all their bombs. Unfortunately, most missed their mark, and the power station sustained only minor damage. During the operation, 3 Blenheim bombers were damaged by anti-aircraft fire. 1 Spitfire was shot down, and the RAF claimed to have shot down 2 German fighters. In later interviews, Gallen claimed that the British had bombed his airfield before dropping the prosthetic leg. This was actually a misremembering on his part. The prosthetic airdrop had in fact taken place before the bombing raid. Even so, the Germans were furious. The British had exploited their chivalrous gesture to cover up a bombing mission. Back in the Saint-Omer hospital, a German orderly delivered the wooden crate to Bader's ward and opened it in front of him. The new right prosthetic leg inside was newer and lighter than the one he had lost, with better quality straps. It had been made by Dart Brothers of London, coincidentally the very same company that had made his first pair of prosthetics back in 1932. Bader put on the new prosthetic immediately, stood up, and took a few steps around the ward. The German doctor watching him asked if it fit properly. Bader smiled and replied, "It's perfect." That afternoon, Bader sent a message back through the Red Cross. Just 3 words: prosthetic received. On August 21st, the Royal Air Force confirmed receipt of the message. But the fighter command also noticed another key piece of information. The German security measures at the Saint-Omer hospital were surprisingly lax. The ward windows had no iron bars. The guard shift changes were highly regular, and there was only 1 guard on each corridor at night. This was just a temporary holding facility, not a proper prisoner of war camp by any stretch of the imagination. Bader had also noticed these security loopholes immediately. Now that he had 2 functional prosthetic legs, he could walk and climb with ease. Moreover, the hospital bed sheets were made of thick cotton fabric, perfect for tearing into strips to make an escape rope. His ward was on the 2nd floor, 20 feet above the ground, with a farm field outside the window and a road stretching westward beyond it. If he could reach that road, he would only have to walk 15 miles to reach the English Channel. In the dead of night on August 24th, Bader tore 4 bed sheets into strips and tied them tightly together, securing one end firmly to the bed frame. He waited patiently until 2 a.m., then quietly pushed open the window, lowered the strip rope to the ground, and grabbed hold of it to start climbing down. But halfway down, a hospital worker spotted him through a first-floor window and shouted loudly. German guards arrived at the scene within 30 seconds and hauled Bader back into the ward at 2:15 a.m. The German guards confiscated all his bedsheets and posted an extra guard outside his ward door. At 7 a.m. the next morning, the hospital director came to the ward and informed Bader that he would be transferred. The Saint-Omer hospital was no longer suitable for detaining a prisoner who had attempted to escape. The Luftwaffe had decided to send him to a maximum security prisoner of war camp, the Stalag Luft III in Sagen, located in the German-occupied Poland. On August 27th, Bader was escorted by German guards onto a train and arrived at Stalag Luft III on August 30th. The camp held approximately 2,000 Royal Air Force prisoners of war, most of whom were pilots shot down over Europe. The camp was divided into several compounds, each surrounded by double barbed wire fences, with guard towers at the four corners and searchlights illuminating the area all night long. The camp commandant was Luftwaffe Major Friedrich Wilhelm von Lindiner Wildau. He ran the camp strictly in accordance with the provisions of the Geneva Convention, providing adequate food and medical care, allowing prisoners to send and receive letters and parcels through the Red Cross. But even so, the British prisoners in the camp had been planning their escape since the camp opened in April 1941. One of the first prisoners Bader met was Group Captain Roger Bushell, who was the mastermind behind the camp's escape plans. Bushell had known Bader before. Back in 1931, before Bader's crash, they had served together in No. 23 Squadron. Bushell was overjoyed to see him, welcoming him warmly and giving him a detailed briefing on the escape plans underway in the camp. Bader made his position clear right away. He wanted in on the escape attempt. Bushell was honest with him about the difficulties. The camp was extremely far from any neutral country. Switzerland was 600 miles to the southwest, Sweden 400 miles to the north, and the surrounding area was all German-occupied Polish territory. Most prisoners who had escaped in the past had barely made it 50 miles before being recaptured, usually within 48 hours. But Bader's resolve was unshakable. We have to try anyway. In fact, even before Bader's arrival, the German guards at Stalag Luft 3 had already heard all about him. The British ace pilot with prosthetic legs, who had tried to escape from the St. Omer hospital just 5 days after receiving his new prosthetic. To prevent him from attempting to escape again, the camp commandant implemented a special security measure. Every night at 10 p.m., guards would enter Bader's barracks, confiscate both of his prosthetic legs, and return them only at 6 a.m. the next morning. This way, Bader couldn't walk at night, couldn't participate in tunnel digging work, and couldn't even get close to the barbed wire fences. But even so, Bader found a way to contribute to the escape plans. He joined the document forgery team. The British prisoners had already established a sophisticated document forgery system capable of producing fake German travel permits, identity papers, work permits, and all kinds of other documents. But the forgery work required access to real document samples, as well as knowledge of German administrative procedures, railway timetables, and guard shift patterns. By talking with other prisoners, Bader gathered a great deal of key information, providing invaluable assistance to the document forgery effort. In October 1941, a prisoner named Bill Ash proposed a bold escape plan. Ash had obtained a cockpit diagram of a Messerschmitt Bf-110 fighter, as well as instruction manuals for engine startup and flight operations. 150 miles southeast of the camp, there was a German training airfield where several Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters were parked. Ash's plan was, 2 prisoners would sneak into a work detail being sent outside the camp, steal a Bf-109 fighter, and fly it to Sweden or Switzerland. To pull off this plan, the first step was to get assigned to an outside work detail. British prisoners were sometimes sent to work outside the camp, repairing roads, cutting down trees, and although they were guarded by German soldiers, the guard shift changes were frequent, and there were always moments of slack supervision. Ash intended to use forged documents in a German uniform that the prisoners had secretly pieced together over several months to switch identities with 2 prisoners who had been assigned to a work detail in Glavitz. Bader volunteered for the mission without a moment's hesitation. Ash was honest with him about the plan's fatal flaw. Glavitz was far too distant from Sweden and Switzerland. The Bf-109 fighter had an operational radius of only 400 miles, and taking off from Glavitz, it couldn't reach either neutral country. Even if they flew southwest toward Switzerland, they would have to cross heavily fortified German air defense zones, a near impossible task. But Bader's response was the same as always. How do we know unless we try? On November 3rd, a work detail consisting of 20 British prisoners and 4 German guards set off for Glavitz. Ash and Bader successfully swapped places with 2 prisoners who were originally supposed to go. Their forged documents identified them as Royal Air Force flying officers assigned to road construction work. The guards checked their papers at the camp gate and found nothing suspicious, letting them pass without a second glance. The detail traveled to Glavitz in a transport truck, arriving on November 4th. The German training airfield was just 3 miles away from the work camp, and Ash and Bader could even see the fighters parked on the airfield from a distance. But when they sneaked close to the perimeter of the airfield, they discovered a fatal problem. The aircraft parked there were not Bf-109 fighters at all, but the much older Bf-109E model. This variant had an operational radius of only 250 miles, and taking off from their location, it couldn't even reach the border of a neutral country, let alone cross it. Ash and Bader held an urgent discussion. Should they risk stealing a Bf-109E and flying west, gambling that they could reach Allied-controlled territory before running out of fuel? But they both knew deep down that the German air defense network in western Poland was extremely dense, with radar stations, anti-aircraft gun positions, and fighter squadrons scattered everywhere. 2 British pilots flying a stolen German fighter would be lucky to survive even 30 minutes. With no other options, the 2 men had to abandon the plan and return to the work camp, waiting for the next opportunity. But disaster struck on November 5th. A German inspector arrived at Stalag Luft 3 for a routine check. When he cross-referenced the prisoner roster, he discovered that 2 prisoners were missing from Bader's barracks. The Germans launched an immediate investigation, quickly uncovering the truth about the identity swap, and sent a search notice to the authorities in Glavitz within hours. Within a few short hours, Ash and Bader's cover was blown. On November 6, German military police arrived at the Glavitz work camp, arrested the 2 men, and transported them back to Stalag Luft 3. Camp Commandant von Lindiner was furious when he heard the news. The prisoners' forged documents were so well made that they had fooled multiple security checkpoints, making a mockery of the camp's document management system. Under camp regulations, prisoners who attempted to escape and failed were to be punished with 10 days of solitary confinement. Bader was locked in a tiny cell, only 8 feet long and 6 feet wide. The cell had nothing but a small window, a bed, and a chamber pot. He was given only 2 meals a day, had no books to read, and was forbidden from communicating with other prisoners. To make matters worse, the German guards still confiscated his prosthetic legs every night. After serving his full sentence, von Lindiner imposed additional restrictions on him. For 3 days after his release from solitary confinement, Bader was placed under constant surveillance. A guard followed him everywhere, when he ate, when he exercised, even when he used the toilet. On November 16th, Bader was finally released, returning to the prisoners' communal barracks. The strict surveillance lasted only 3 days before the German guards began to relax their vigilance. After all, there were far too many prisoners and far too few guards to keep track of everyone closely. Just 1 week later, Bader was able to move freely around the camp again. He rejoined the escape committee and began planning his next escape attempt. In November 1941, 3 tunnels were being dug secretly at Stalag Luft 3, codenamed Tom, Dick, and Harry. The entrance to Tom was located in Barracks 123, Dick in Barracks 122, and Harry in Barracks 104. Each tunnel was dug 30 feet underground, deep enough to avoid detection by German acoustic sensing equipment. The prisoners worked in shifts, digging the tunnels with stolen tools, shoring up the walls with bedboards, and secretly disposing of the excavated soil by dumping it in the camp vegetable garden and latrines, mixing it with the existing dirt to hide any trace of the digging. Because of his prosthetic legs, Bader was unable to crawl through the narrow tunnels to help with the digging, but he volunteered to take on the role of ground lookout, responsible for monitoring the movements of the German guards, recording the intervals between their patrols, and distributing the forged documents to the escape teams. In December 1941, the Germans discovered the Tom Tunnel during a surprise inspection. The guards found the entrance, flooded the tunnel with water, and arrested 15 prisoners who had been involved in the digging. But the Dick and Harry tunnels remained undiscovered. Winter soon set in, with temperatures dropping below freezing. The frozen ground made digging extremely difficult, and disposing of the excavated soil became a major problem. The thick layer of snow would clearly show any traces of fresh dirt. The escape committee decided to suspend large-scale digging operations until the following spring, focusing in the meantime on making preparations, forging more documents, collecting civilian clothing, and studying railway timetables. In March 1942, Bader received a transfer order. The German High Command had reviewed his file and discovered that in just 7 months, he had attempted to escape 5 times. The escape attempt from the Saint-Omer Hospital, the Gliwice escape plan, and 3 more escape plots planned at Stalag Luft III, all of which had been uncovered while still in the preparation stage. The Luftwaffe classified him as a persistent escape risk and decided to transfer him to a maximum security prisoner of war camp, codenamed Oflag 4C, better known to the prisoners as Colditz Castle. Colditz Castle was located in Saxony, Germany, 80 miles south of Berlin, perched atop a cliff overlooking the Mulde River. The walls of this medieval castle were 7 feet thick. All windows were fitted with iron bars, and the ratio of guards to prisoners was an astonishing 1-to-1, making it the most heavily guarded prisoner of war camp in Germany. The prisoners held here were all problem cases, who had attempted to escape multiple times from other camps, prisoners that ordinary camps simply couldn't contain. On April 2, 1942, Bader arrived at Colditz Castle. The camp held approximately 200 prisoners from various countries: Britain, France, Poland, the Netherlands, Belgium, and more, and every single one of them was a persistent escape artist. The senior British officer in the camp was Colonel Willie Todd. He gave Bader a detailed briefing on the camp's security situation. Guards patrolled around the clock, prisoners were counted 4 times a day, and surprise searches and cell inspections were conducted regularly. Any prisoner caught attempting to escape would be immediately transferred to a disciplinary camp in Germany proper. But the prisoners at Colditz Castle were a resourceful bunch. They had even secretly built a glider in the castle attic, planning to launch it from the roof, fly over the Mulde River, and land in neutral territory. The prisoner engineers in charge of building the glider had calculated the takeoff speed, glide ratio, and landing distance with precise accuracy. However, the glider wouldn't be ready until the autumn at the earliest, and the project had to be kept strictly secret. The German guards never patrolled the attic, as its steep, narrow stairs and remote location had long been forgotten by them. In May 1942, Bader met the glider construction team and offered his help. He had learned to fly gliders during his training at the Royal Air Force College in 1929, and he had an in-depth knowledge of aerodynamics, lift coefficients, and stall speeds. The construction team welcomed his assistance with open arms, but the glider wouldn't be ready to fly until the fall at the earliest. Bader decided not to wait that long and began exploring other escape methods. In June 1942, he joined a new tunnel digging plan. The tunnel would start from the basement of the castle chapel and aim to break through the outer castle wall. At the time, the tunnel had already been dug 20 feet underground and 40 feet in length. Only 8 more feet of digging would be needed to penetrate the outer wall. But on July 8th, the German guards discovered the tunnel during a routine inspection, and 12 prisoners involved in the digging were arrested. Bader escaped being implicated only because he had been assigned to ground lookout duty that day. When the camp commandant heard the news, he immediately called a meeting of all prisoners and announced new security measures. All tunnel entrances would be permanently sealed with concrete, the chapel basement would be closed off completely, and the rations of all prisoners would be cut for 2 weeks as a collective punishment. Bader was singled out by name and transferred to an even more secure cell, where guards would conduct 2 surprise inspections at random times every day. Over the next 3 years at Colditz Castle, Bader made 4 more escape attempts, but all of them were uncovered by the Germans before they could be carried out. By the spring of 1945, Nazi Germany was on its last legs. The Allies launched a full-scale offensive on both the eastern and western fronts. The Soviet Red Army was advancing steadily westward from Poland, while the U.S. Army was pushing eastward from France. On April 16, 1945, troops from the U.S. First Army finally reached the area near Colditz Castle. At 9 a.m. that day, the prisoners inside Colditz Castle heard the distant rumble of artillery fire. It was the sound of U.S. artillery, and it was getting closer and closer. Throughout the morning, German guards abandoned their posts one by one, fleeing in a hurry. By noon, only the camp commandant and 3 guards remained in the castle. At 2 p.m., U.S. Sherman tanks rumbled up to the castle gates, manned by soldiers from the 69th Infantry Division of the First Army. The gates swung open slowly, and 200 prisoners walked out of the castle, finally free. At 2:30 p.m., Bader stepped out into the castle courtyard. It was the first time he had set foot outside the gates in 3 years. The U.S. soldiers stared in astonishment at the way he walked, at his obviously prosthetic leg, their faces filled with disbelief. A U.S. lieutenant approached him and asked how long he had been a prisoner. Bader replied, "Since August 1941, 3 years and 9 months. The lieutenant then pointed at his leg and asked what had happened. Bader replied casually, "Lost them in 1931. Started flying again in 1940. The lieutenant couldn't believe his ears at first, until other British prisoners stepped forward to confirm his story, leaving him completely dumbfounded. The U.S. Army transported the rescued prisoners to a prisoner of war processing center in Western Germany. On April 18th, Bader finally reached the U.S.-controlled zone, where he met a Royal Air Force liaison officer. After verifying his identity, the liaison officer immediately arranged for him to return to Britain. On April 22, 1945, Bader flew back to the UK, landing at RAF Northolt. It had been exactly 3 years and 9 months since he was shot down. He was 34 years old. The Royal Air Force interrogated him in detail for 2 days, asking about conditions in the German prisoner of war camps, security measures, guard shift patterns, and the locations of escape tunnels. Bader told them everything he had seen and experienced at Stalag Luft III and Colditz Castle, and the interrogators recorded the information in meticulous detail. But the interrogators also told Bader something he never could have imagined. He was already a household name. During his time as a prisoner of war, the British media had told his story to the entire nation. The ace pilot with no legs who had shot down 23 enemy planes. The tough-as-nails prisoner who had tried to escape again and again after being shot down by the Germans. People all across Britain knew the name Douglas Bader. In June 1945, the Royal Air Force held a grand victory flypast over London. 300 aircraft flew in formation to commemorate the victory in the Battle of Britain and celebrate the liberation of Europe. Air Commodore Trafford Lee Mallory personally selected Bader to lead the formation as the lead pilot. Bader would fly a Spitfire fighter, leading 300 aircraft over the heart of London. At 3 p.m. on June 15, 1945, Bader took off from RAF Duxford in a Supermarine Spitfire Mk9. Behind him, a massive formation of 300 aircraft followed closely, including Hurricanes, Spitfires, Typhoons, and Tempests. The formation flew south, reaching London at 4 p.m. Bader led the aircraft over Buckingham Palace, the Palace of Westminster, and the River Thames in sequence. On the ground below, thousands of people cheered and applauded, their voices ringing out like thunder. By then, the war in Europe had been over for 5 weeks. Germany had unconditionally surrendered, and Adolf Hitler was already dead. This flypast was a celebration of Britain's victory, and leading this celebration was a pilot who should have never been allowed to fly again. In February 1946, the 35-year-old Bader retired from the Royal Air Force officially. He had served in the military for 6 years, fighting in the skies from 1940 to 1941, and enduring life as a prisoner of war from 1941 to 1945. The RAF offered him a position on the general staff, responsible for administrative work at the training command, but Bader politely declined the offer. The horrors of war had left him weary of military life. He returned to Shell Oil Company, the same company that had employed him from 1932 to 1939. Shell appointed him as the general manager of Shell Aviation Limited, in charge of the company's corporate aviation division. He flew the company's aircraft, managed flight operations, and frequently traveled around the world for promotional events. But Bader never forgot about others with disabilities like himself. He devoted more and more of his time to advocating for the rights of disabled military veterans, joining the British Limbless Ex-Servicemen's Association and serving as one of its directors. He attended various events frequently, visited hospitals, and sat down to talk with military veterans who had been disabled in the war, sharing his own story and showing them his prosthetic legs, proving to them that disability did not mean inability. He always repeated the same message, tirelessly: a disabled person who dares to fight back is not a cripple, he is a hero. In 1954, author Paul Brickhill published Bader's biography, Reach for the Sky. The book became an instant bestseller in Britain as soon as it was released. 2 years later, the book was adapted into a feature film of the same name, with actor Kenneth More portraying Bader. The film brought Bader's story to audiences all over the world, making him a global icon and a national hero. The film also unexpectedly reunited Bader with an old acquaintance, Adolf Galland. Galland had survived World War II and surrendered to the U.S. Army in May 1945. After the war, he returned to Germany and lived a quiet life as a civilian. In 1953, Galland traveled to Britain specially to meet Bader in London. Their meeting was warm and friendly, filled with professional respect. They talked about their respective war experiences, aerial combat tactics, and their time as prisoners for Bader and as camp commanders for Galland. As they talked, they were astonished to discover that during the war, they had flown missions on the same days and in the same airspace multiple times. They might even have fought against each other in aerial combat, completely unaware of each other's identity at the time. This reunion marked the beginning of a decades-long friendship between the two men. Galland visited Britain frequently, and Bader traveled to Germany to see him in return. They attended aviation events, air shows, and military veteran gatherings together. Once bitter enemies, they had become close friends who deeply respected each other. In 1976, Bader was knighted by the Queen of the United Kingdom in recognition of his outstanding contributions to the rights of disabled people. But by 1982, Bader's health began to deteriorate rapidly. Years of walking on prosthetic legs had taken a heavy toll on his body, and he had also been suffering from heart disease for a long time. His body was simply worn out. On the evening of September 5, 1982, Bader attended a banquet at the Guildhall in London, held to commemorate Marshal of the Royal Air Force Sir Arthur Harris, the Commander-in-Chief of Bomber Command during World War II. During the banquet, Bader suffered a sudden heart attack and passed away at the age of 72. On September 15, 1982, Bader's funeral was held at RAF Hendon. Hundreds of people came to pay their respects, including senior RAF officers, former pilots from No. 242 Squadron, fellow prisoners from Colditz Castle, and representatives from the British Limbless Ex-Servicemen's Association. Adolf Galland, who was now elderly and in poor health, was unable to attend the funeral in person from his home in Germany, but he sent a wreath accompanied by a simple eulogy. He was a great fighter pilot and an even greater man. Bader's legacy goes far beyond his 23 confirmed kills. His status as the fifth highest-scoring ace of the Battle of Britain, or his promotion to wing commander at just 30 years old. What truly cemented his place in history is the truth he proved to the world with his life. Disability is never a reason to write someone off. Unwavering determination can overcome any institutional barrier. A double amputee can fly fighter jets better than many able-bodied pilots. In 1932, the Royal Air Force rejected him on the grounds of physical disability, citing strict regulations with no room for exceptions. But when war broke out and Britain needed every pilot it could get, those cold, inflexible regulations were rewritten. For him, it wasn't because the regulations were wrong. It was because Bader proved that the regulations were incomplete. He showed the world with his actions that physical disability does not equal a loss of ability. With prosthetic legs, he could still perform high-G aerial maneuvers, still execute aerobatics, still shoot down enemy fighters in combat. Inspired by his example, countless military pilots who had lost limbs in the war regained their hope of flying again. They used Bader as their role model, submitting applications to the Royal Air Force to be reinstated, declaring, "If he can fly, we can too." The Royal Air Force was forced to re-examine its policies as a result, beginning to evaluate each case individually. In the end, many amputee pilots were able to return to the skies. Not all of them, but far more than in the days before Bader. His escape attempts also inspired countless Allied prisoners of war detained in German camps. Not because his escapes were successful, in fact, most of his attempts ended in failure, but because he never stopped trying. Just 5 months after losing one of his prosthetic legs, he dared to use bed sheets as a rope to climb out of a second-floor hospital window. 6 months later, he was plotting to steal a German fighter jet to escape. Even when the Germans confiscated his prosthetic legs every night, he never stopped fighting back. The prisoners at Colditz Castle called him stubborn as a mule, a man with a will of steel, unbreakable, and these were the highest compliments they could give him. After the war, his advocacy work helped tens of thousands of people. Members of the British Limbless Ex-Servicemen's Association, patients in hospitals, and military veterans who had just been disabled in the war, all of them regained the courage to live their lives to the fullest thanks to his encouragement. He visited them personally, showing them his prosthetic legs, walking steadily without a cane, proving to them that anything was possible. The message he conveyed was simple yet powerful. Whether disability becomes a barrier depends only on whether you are willing to accept its limitations. Stand up and fight back, adapt to your circumstances, surpass yourself. That is the only way forward. Coming from a man who had lost both legs at 21, but led 300 aircraft over London at 34, these words carried the weight of absolute truth. Today, the Douglas Bader Foundation continues his legacy, providing assistance to disabled people around the world, offering financial grants to those in need, funding the purchase of mobility aids, and helping disabled individuals achieve independent living. Since its establishment, the foundation has helped tens of thousands of disabled people. Countless aircraft carriers, schools, and public buildings have been named in his honor. There is a Bader Hall at the Royal Air Force College Cranwell, and streets named after him can be found in many cities across Britain. His prosthetic legs are now preserved as precious historical artifacts at the Royal Air Force Museum in Stafford, though they are not currently on public display. There has been some debate among aviation historians about the big wing tactic, whether large-scale fighter formations were actually more effective than dispersed squadron tactics during the Battle of Britain. But these debates overlook the most important point of all. At a time when Britain needed courage and leadership more than ever, Bader stepped forward to answer the call. He transformed a demoralized Canadian squadron into an elite fighting force. In an era when the prevailing strategy was defensive, he took the initiative to lead formations deep into enemy territory, launching offensive strikes. He successfully pinned down Luftwaffe forces in France, preventing them from reinforcing the Eastern Front. His life is the ultimate testament to the power of never giving up. The Royal Air Force said he couldn't fly, so he took to the skies anyway. Doctors said a double amputee couldn't withstand the G-forces of aerial combat, yet he could pull tighter turns than able-bodied pilots. The Germans said he couldn't escape from their prisoner of war camps, so he tried again and again, defying them at every turn. Douglas Bader proved to the world with his life that prosthetic legs can shoot down Messerschmitt fighters. A man who was told his flying career was over at 21 could still command a fighter wing at 30. He never let his disability define his life. He wrote his own legend with courage, determination, and an unbreakable will to soar. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button. Every like helps YouTube share this forgotten hero story with more people around the world. If you haven't subscribed yet, make sure to click the subscribe button and turn on notifications. Every day we dig into dusty archives to uncover more forgotten hero stories. The pilots who refused to give up, the true stories of bravery and sacrifice that deserve to be remembered. Now let us know where you're watching this video from in the comments section. Are you watching from the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, or Australia? Our audience is spread all over the world. You are not just a viewer, you are part of a great mission to ensure that these heroes' stories are never lost to the sands of time. Tell us where you're watching from, and feel free to share if any members of your family have served in the military. Thank you for watching, and thank you for helping to ensure that the name Douglas Bader is never forgotten by history. These heroes deserve to be remembered, always.